Two racist, corrupt police officers handcuffed a black man and dragged him into court, but what they didn't know was that this ordinary black man was a decorated Marine sniper, and what happened next inside that courtroom left everyone speechless. It started like so many other stories that shouldn't happen anymore. A routine traffic stop. A quiet street. No threats. No backup needed. Just a man driving home from work, alone, steady, calm. But that wasn't enough. His skin was a target. His calm was misread as arrogance. His silence, mistaken for guilt. And when he rolled down the window and politely handed over his license and registration, he already knew the tone. He'd heard it before. Step out of the vehicle. Now. What's the problem, officer? You look nervous. That's problem enough. But I haven't done anything wrong. Don't argue. Hands where I can see them. It escalated fast. Too fast. Within seconds, he was being yanked from his own car, thrown onto the hood. No explanations. No decency. His bag searched without a warrant. His trunk ripped open. The laptop in his passenger seat confiscated. No Miranda rights. Just metal cuffs and a smirk. You're being detained for suspicion of auto theft. This is my car. Yeah. Not anymore. In that moment, it wasn't just a false accusation, it was a theft of dignity. Of humanity. Of history. They dragged him across the road like he was a criminal caught in the act. Cameras from stores nearby picked up the scene. Pedestrians stopped, watching, some recording. But most looked away. Avoiding the weight of what they knew they were witnessing. A tall, muscular black man, subdued by two white cops who were all too eager to flex their power, not because he posed danger, but because they could. The humiliation didn't end there. They marched him through the courthouse lobby like a trophy, still cuffed, even as he asked to speak with a lawyer. They mocked him. Got yourself in real deep this time, huh? You boys ever stop a white guy like this? He asked, trying to remain composed, chest tight, blood boiling. Depends. Do they look like they just stole a car and lied about it? You didn't even run the plates. Oh, we ran them all right. Let's just say they didn't match your profile. They laughed. He didn't. And when they entered the courtroom, loud, proud, cocky, dragging him like an exhibit, it was supposed to be the final blow. A performance. They wanted everyone in that room to see what kind of trash they thought they'd caught. A criminal. A suspect. A black man with no voice, no chance, no status. But what they didn't know, and what would flip the courtroom upside down just moments later, was this: the man they had humiliated wasn't just anyone. He wasn't lost, he wasn't fragile, and he damn sure wasn't powerless. He had spent years in service of a country that now turned a blind eye to men like him. He had lain for days in foreign deserts with a rifle in his hands and wind in his eyes, defending the very freedoms now being stripped from him by the men in blue beside him. He had earned medals that those officers could never even comprehend. He had saved lives, even the lives of men who looked like the very ones who now treated him as less than human. He had stayed silent because silence was his weapon. Because he knew that real justice doesn't always come loud, but it always comes precise. And in that courtroom, when truth started peeling back the layers of that day, when the judge suddenly froze, eyes narrowing, hands trembling, recognizing the man in chains not as a criminal, but as a fellow soldier who had once saved his life in the dead of night on foreign soil, everything changed. Because behind those shackles was not guilt, but honor. Not shame, but power. And for the first time in their careers, those officers watched as their certainty collapsed. The courtroom, once heavy with judgment, turned into a battlefield of truth. A truth too loud to silence. And yet, this is just the beginning. Because what happened next, the testimony, the revelation, the faces in the courtroom, the secrets suddenly brought to light, would not only destroy everything those two officers thought they had built, but would force every single person in that courthouse to confront the truth about who this man really was, and who they really were. So the question is, what does a man trained to wait, to observe, and to strike at the exact right moment, do when he's finally pushed too far? You're not ready for what's coming. Stay with us. Before we begin today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black audience. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We recognize the pain, the injustice, and the weight of experiences that too often go unseen or unheard. Your voice matters. Your life matters. Your dignity matters. This channel is a space of respect, reflection, and powerful storytelling where justice always finds its way, and no truth stays buried forever. Now, take a deep breath. You're about to hear a story that will shake you, inspire you, and remind you of the strength that lives in silence. Enjoy the story. And if you believe in stories that bring truth to light, hit that subscribe button and join us. Let's begin. He didn't talk much about the war. Not because he was ashamed of it, far from it, but because in the civilian world, the silence carried more weight than the truth ever could. His name was Malik Hayes, 37, born and raised in Mobile, Alabama, now settled in Richmond, Virginia, in a modest home on a quiet street where kids still played with chalk on the sidewalk and neighbors nodded politely but rarely stopped to talk. Malik liked it that way. Peace, after all, was a rare luxury for someone who had spent over a decade crouched behind walls, perched on rooftops, or buried in dirt, eyes fixed on targets through a sniper scope, calculating wind direction and distance with nothing but intuition and breath control. He had been one of the best in the Marine Corps, an elite sniper whose record was whispered with reverence in some circles and denied entirely in others. There were missions that had never made it into official records. Assignments buried under layers of classification. Malik had seen things. Done things. And somehow, through it all, he'd held on to something few others did, his humanity. That was his greatest strength, and his deepest vulnerability. When he came home, he didn't want a parade. He didn't need applause. He wanted silence, routine, something close to ordinary. He worked part-time at a security consulting firm downtown, trained young recruits on weekends at a local self-defense center, and occasionally wrote articles for military journals under a pseudonym. He wore clothes that didn't draw attention, moved like a man with nothing to prove, and smiled the kind of smile that made people pause, not wide, but warm, like it came from a deeper place. But Malik also understood something else. That even with a clean record, with medals, with honorable discharge papers folded neatly in a drawer, the world didn't always see who you are. Sometimes, it only sees what it wants to. And on one ordinary Tuesday morning, driving his silver SUV through the west end of Richmond on his way to a training session, that truth would strike harder than any bullet ever had. He was dressed casually, fitted jeans, a navy blue t-shirt, tactical boots. His face was clean-shaven, his beard trimmed, hair close-cropped. He looked like a man who took care of himself. A man who was simply going about his day. His phone buzzed once, a text from his sister confirming their dinner plans, as he adjusted the volume on the radio. He didn't see the patrol car trailing him until the lights flashed. No siren. Just a quiet, controlled flash of red and blue in his rearview mirror. He pulled over without hesitation. Hands on the wheel. Window halfway down. No sudden movements. Two officers stepped out. White. Mid-40s. Broad shoulders. Tinted sunglasses. One rested his hand on the holster before even approaching. The other walked slower, chin up, scanning Malik's vehicle like it had already confessed to something. License and registration, the first one said, tone flat. Malik handed both over with a nod, already feeling the tension thickening. Is there a reason I was stopped? You fit a description, said the second. Vehicle similar to one reported stolen from a few blocks over. It's registered in my name, Malik said calmly. You can run the plates. We will, the first officer said, glancing briefly at the documents before motioning his partner to circle around the back of the car. There was a moment, brief, but unmistakable, where Malik could feel the shift. The hesitation, the flicker of doubt, followed quickly by a hardened decision. They weren't here to verify facts. They were here for something else. For dominance. For confirmation of a bias already baked into the moment they pulled him over. When the second officer opened the trunk without permission, Malik spoke up. "You don't have a warrant." "You got something to hide," came the reply. "My rights," Malik said. "That's what I have." "Wrong answer." "Step out of the car," the first officer ordered. "For what reason?" The reply was a laugh. Sharp. Cruel. "Because I said so." What followed felt surreal even as it was happening. Malik was pulled from his vehicle, his arms yanked behind his back, cold metal pressing into his wrists. People slowed down as they drove by. A woman across the street paused her jog to stare. A teenager walking a dog took out his phone. But no one intervened. They pressed Malik against the hood, patted him down, ignored his questions, called in the suspect. When backup arrived, the second squad car parked aggressively, as if preparing for a standoff. But there was no threat. Only a man, silent now, eyes locked on the horizon, letting the humiliation seep into his skin like poison. The two officers were well known in the area. Sergeant Rick Holland and Officer Jake Mercer. Both had years on the force. Both had been the subject of internal complaints, most dismissed, a few buried. They operated with a kind of arrogance that came not from ignorance but from impunity. They knew which lines not to cross, or how to cover it when they did. To them, Malik was just another body to be processed. Another box to check. A black man in a good car, in a nice neighborhood, who had the audacity to question them. They didn't notice the way he held his breath. The way he scanned their formation, memorized badge numbers, measured distances. They didn't see the calm in his fingers or the restraint in his voice. Because to them, he didn't matter. He wasn't supposed to. He was booked on suspicion of grand theft auto, a charge so flimsy even the clerk at intake raised an eyebrow. But the paperwork was filed. The story was written. And Malik was led, still in cuffs, into the very courthouse where he had once served on a community advisory panel about policing reform. The walk through the corridor was long, and every second of it burned. Not from shame, he knew who he was, but from the eyes. The stares. Some sympathetic. Most indifferent. The officers behind him cracked quiet jokes, confident in their position, dismissive of any consequences. Malik didn't respond. He didn't speak. But inside, something was shifting. Not just rage. Not just pain. Something deeper. Focused. Intentional. Because Malik Hayes had been underestimated before, in enemy territory, in hostile zones, under threat of death. And each time, he had survived. Thrived. Outmaneuvered those who thought they had the upper hand. He knew how to wait. How to endure. How to strike only when the target was completely exposed. And this time, the target wasn't miles away through a scope. It was standing 2 feet behind him, grinning. And it had no idea what was coming. Malik sat in the holding room, the walls dull and the air stale, the cuffs long since removed but the ache in his wrist still pulsing, like a silent reminder that no matter what he had done in his life, no matter how much he had given, the world could still chain him down in an instant. Across the room, a rusted clock ticked too loudly. The fluorescent lights hummed like a warning. Time was dragging, but his thoughts moved faster than ever. His face was calm, but inside, something deliberate was building, not anger exactly, not fear either, but calculation. The kind that came from years of training, from endless hours spent assessing environments, anticipating movement, sensing patterns. He was no longer in a war zone, but the battlefield was familiar. A clerk finally opened the door and signaled him forward, eyes briefly locking with Malik's before quickly turning away. Malik stood tall, shoulders squared. He wasn't going to shrink himself for anyone. As he walked the hallway leading to the courtroom, he could hear voices, subtle, muffled, laughter maybe. When he reached the door, a young officer motioned him to wait just outside. The courtroom wasn't ready yet. So he stood there, silently, listening. Inside, Sergeant Rick Holland was leaning against the wall near the prosecution's table, coffee in one hand, smirk already plastered across his face. "You think he's still playing the innocent routine," he said to Mercer, who was flipping through a folder of fabricated reports and half-true statements. Mercer chuckled. "Probably rehearsing some speech in his head. Let him. None of that's gonna matter when the judge sees that evidence. Plate mismatch, false registration, resisting verbal commands, textbook. Case'll be over before lunch. And people wonder why they get pulled over," Holland muttered, not even trying to keep his voice down. "Guy looked like trouble the second we saw him. He's lucky we didn't drag him in face first." A court aide walked by, glanced at them, and then away, uneasy, but silent. Back outside, Malik exhaled slowly. He'd heard enough. Not just today, his whole life had been marked by these kinds of dismissals. But now it was out in the open. And there was something about hearing it like that, raw, unfiltered, casual, that did something to a man. Still, his face didn't twitch. His breath didn't change. He stepped into the courtroom when called, as if nothing had been said at all. Inside, the space felt colder than he remembered. Benches sparsely filled. A few observers. A reporter scribbling notes, mostly out of obligation. The judge, an older white man with a deep frown etched into his forehead, flipped through papers as if reading the weather. "State of Virginia versus Malik Hayes," the clerk announced. Malik took his place beside the court-appointed attorney, a woman named Gloria Chavez, mid-30s, sharp eyes, tired smile. She had read the file, skimmed the surface of the accusations, and knew something didn't add up. She leaned over to him before the session began. "I need you to be honest with me," she whispered. "Did you provoke them? Did you say anything threatening?" "No," Malik said quietly. "They pulled me over. That's all." She watched him a second longer, then nodded. There was something in his voice. Controlled. Steady. She had seen liars before, nervous, defensive, shaky. This wasn't that. This man didn't just believe he was innocent. He knew it. The prosecution opened with rehearsed confidence. Mercer presented their side with a parade of buzzwords: suspicious behavior, potential vehicle theft, failure to comply. He mentioned Malik's agitated tone, his uncooperative posture. Everything sounded just vague enough to be believable. Holland took the stand and described the incident with the swagger of someone used to being believed. He became verbally aggressive, Holland said, eyes on the jury, voice firm. Refused direct commands. We followed protocol. Used minimum force necessary. Our priority, as always, was safety. Was he armed? Gloria asked during cross-examination. No. Did he threaten you? He was confrontational. Did he physically resist arrest? No, but his demeanor, she repeated. And what exactly does that mean? Holland paused. He had a look in his eyes. Like he didn't respect authority. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. Gloria didn't push further. She didn't need to. That moment spoke louder than anything else could have. Later, Malik took the stand. He wasn't coached. He wasn't theatrical. He simply told the truth. Calmly. Respectfully. Every word measured. I was driving to a training session, he said. I work in security. I help train young people on how to stay safe in violent situations. They stopped me. I cooperated. When I asked why, they told me I fit a description. When I asked again, they said I looked nervous. That's when they pulled me out of the car. Searched it without permission. Cuffed me. Took me in. And your vehicle? Gloria asked. It's registered to me. Has been for 4 years. Paid off last March. Were you resisting at any point? No. Why do you think this happened? A pause. Then he said, because some people see a black man and don't see a man at all. The room fell into silence. After the session, the judge adjourned for the day. Gloria packed her notes, nodding silently to Malik. You did well, she said. But this isn't over. In the hallway, Mercer and Holland exchanged quiet comments again, not realizing Gloria had circled back to grab a forgotten folder. She caught just enough to hear Mercer mutter, "Can't believe this guy's still trying to play the hero." "Let him," Holland replied. "We've buried guys like him before." That night, Malik sat on his porch, the city quiet under a heavy sky. He didn't sleep. He didn't pace. He sat, back straight, replaying every second, every word. There was a file buried in his closet, something no one had ever seen. And a contact in D.C. he hadn't called in years. He had been patient. Respectful. Trusting the system. But there comes a moment, one you can feel before it arrives, when waiting becomes a trap. When silence is mistaken for weakness. And as dawn broke across the sky, Malik finally stood and made the call. Because he had been a sniper once. But now, he was aiming for something else entirely. And by the time the courtroom doors opened again, the target wouldn't even know they'd been marked. What Malik had in motion now would change everything. They thought they knew who he was. They thought they had control. But tomorrow, when the truth walked into that courtroom, it wouldn't be quiet. And it wouldn't miss. The next morning, the air inside the courthouse felt different. Denser. There was an energy floating through the corridors that hadn't been there the day before, a quiet pressure, the kind people feel when they know something is about to break, but they don't know from where. Malik walked through the front doors alone, no cuffs, no escort. Just the sound of his boots echoing on the polished floors. His shoulders were steady, his face unreadable, and yet something behind his eyes suggested this wasn't the same man who had been dragged in 2 days ago. Something in him had shifted. Not just in resolve, that had always been there, but in direction. He had stopped waiting for justice. He was delivering it now. Inside the courtroom, Holland and Mercer stood near the window, joking quietly with another officer. Holland was still smiling, half distracted as he scrolled through his phone. Mercer sipped coffee, glancing occasionally at the door. Neither of them looked concerned. They had done this routine before. They knew how it worked. Malik was just another name on a list they'd forget after the paperwork cleared. Gloria was already seated, her folders open but untouched. Her eyes, however, were sharp. She looked at Malik as he entered, and there was a flicker of something there, not surprise, not confusion, but awareness. As if she had sensed something was coming, and now, she was just waiting for the weight of it to drop. The judge arrived 10 minutes later. Same robe, same grim expression. He shuffled his papers, adjusted his glasses, and cleared his throat. "We'll continue with the proceedings regarding Mr. Malik Hayes. Prosecution, you may proceed." Mercer stood, straightened his tie, and began speaking with a rehearsed tone. "Your Honor, we will now present footage collected from the body cam footage of the officers involved, as well as additional surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras." Malik didn't blink. He let them play their hand. Let them roll out the same narrative, distorted, polished, twisted into a shape that could hold up just enough to satisfy paperwork and policy. The footage showed a quiet street, Malik's SUV pulled over, his figure blurred through the windshield. There were edits. Cuts. Audio gaps. Intentional holes where truth should have lived. Then Gloria stood. "Your Honor," she said, voice calm, "we request permission to submit supplementary evidence, not previously included in the prosecution's report." Mercer scoffed. "Objection. We weren't made aware of any, you were notified this morning," Gloria interrupted smoothly, handing a sealed envelope to the clerk. "Evidence that directly impacts the credibility of the officer's report and speaks to the motivations behind this arrest." The judge looked over the envelope, raised an eyebrow, and gave a slow nod. "Proceed." A large screen was rolled into place. The courtroom dimmed slightly as the footage began to play. There was no dramatic music. No edits. Just raw, silent truth. First, the footage from a local gas station, not included in the original report, showing Malik calmly filling his tank, checking his phone, paying at the pump. Then, the patrol car entering the lot, slowing beside him, circling his vehicle twice before pulling away. Then again, 10 minutes later, tailing him down a side street with no sirens, no call for backup, no dispatch notice. Then the audio, from inside Malik's vehicle, recorded unknowingly through a tactical pen in his center console. A crisp recording, Malik's voice clear, steady. "Is there a reason I was pulled over? You look nervous. That's reason enough." As the courtroom listened, the tone began to shift. Mercer's expression cracked. Holland sat straighter in his chair. People turned toward each other, whispering. Then came the last file. A letter, signed and stamped by the Department of Defense. Gloria stepped forward as it was read aloud. "Mr. Hayes is not only a United States citizen and veteran, he is a highly decorated former Marine Corps Scout sniper with over 12 confirmed missions in direct defense of U.S. national interests, including one where he provided cover for a unit extraction under heavy fire, a unit led, incidentally, by Judge Franklin McAllister, presiding today." Every head turned. The judge froze. For a moment, his face was pale. The silence was heavy. He looked down slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the bench. "Mr. Hayes," he said, voice lower now, "is this true?" Malik stood. "It is." The courtroom shifted again. Something raw passed through the room. Not admiration. Not shock. Something heavier, guilt, shame, realization. Judge McAllister looked at him now not as a defendant, but as a man who had once saved his life from thousands of miles away, without question, without hesitation, without even knowing his name. Gloria continued. "Your Honor, the prosecution failed to disclose the full record of Mr. Hayes. They painted a picture of a hostile, suspicious man, when in fact, he was targeted. Not for what he did, but for what he looks like. For who they assumed he was." Malik stepped forward. "You want to know what I looked like to them?" His voice filled the room, not loud, but undeniable. Not a father. Not a veteran. Not a citizen. Just another black man behind the wheel of a car they didn't think he should own. They saw a threat because that's what they wanted to see. The judge said nothing. For a long moment, no one did. Then Gloria spoke again. "There's one more piece of evidence, Your Honor." Another clip played, a deposition. A familiar voice. The voice of a young officer, the one who had seen Holland and Mercer laughing in the hallway the day before. He spoke clearly, trembling a little, but firm. "I've seen them do this before. Pull people over without reason. Make up just enough to justify the arrest. This time, I couldn't stay quiet." Mercer stood abruptly. "That recording wasn't sanctioned, it was submitted voluntarily," Gloria snapped. "And it's admissible." The judge looked down again, rubbing his temple. Then he turned to Malik. "I don't know how to apologize for this," he said quietly. "But I know what I need to do." Before the gavel dropped, before the verdict was announced, Holland stood, defiant. "This is all twisted." He set this up. Malik turned, meeting his eyes. I didn't need to set you up, he said. You did this to yourself. The judge ordered the charges dismissed. A formal investigation into both officers began immediately. They were escorted out, not as protectors, but as suspects. But it wasn't the reversal that landed hardest. It was the shift in silence. The weight of truth, once denied, now undeniable. People stood as Malik walked out, not out of obligation, but because they felt something they hadn't expected to. Respect. The kind earned not just in combat, but in standing tall when the world tries to knock you down. What they didn't know was that Malik hadn't come for revenge. He came to remind them what justice really looks like. And that sometimes, the quietest man in the room is the one they should have feared all along. The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet when Malik stepped through the doors, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet he had walked into just days before. This one was thick with reverence. The tension that once wrapped around his shoulders like a chokehold had shifted, now carried by the eyes of those who stood watching him. It wasn't pity anymore. It wasn't curiosity. It was something deeper, the realization that they had witnessed something rare, truth, unfiltered and unbreakable, rising in a place built to contain and control it. Malik walked slowly, not because he was unsure, but because he knew the gravity of what had just happened needed space. Every step felt like a release, a closing of some invisible chapter, even if the weight of the whole book still lingered inside him. Gloria walked beside him, her face unreadable at first, then softening as she looked at him. "You okay?" she asked, voice low. "I'm not angry anymore," Malik said quietly. "But I'm not done either." She nodded. "You were never supposed to be." A few reporters called out his name from the steps outside, but Malik didn't stop. He didn't raise his hand or make a statement. The courtroom had said enough. The only thing that mattered now was what came next, not in the public eye, not for headlines, but for something much more personal. He didn't want revenge. What he wanted was repair. Not just for himself, but for every person who'd been pushed to the ground, cuffed, silenced, and never given the chance to stand back up. Inside the precinct that night, Mercer was pacing. His badge had been suspended, his service weapon locked away in a drawer he could no longer access. Holland sat across from internal affairs investigators, arms crossed, refusing to answer questions without his lawyer. The energy between them had changed. The confidence that once lit their steps had cracked, replaced by a twitchy defensiveness neither of them knew how to hide. They had been exposed. And worse, they had been exposed by the very system they thought they had control over. "You really think this guy just walked in with all that by accident?" Mercer hissed under his breath to Holland when the room cleared for a break. "He had help," Holland muttered. "Some lawyer with connections, some Pentagon favor. Doesn't matter. They'll forget this in a month." "Will they?" Mercer shot back, eyes narrowing. "Because I keep thinking about that judge. You saw his face. He wasn't doing us any favors." Holland leaned forward, his voice low and bitter. "You listen to me. We've been on this force 15 years. We've done more for this city than anyone. We don't go down because of one mistake." Mercer laughed quietly. "You still think that was a mistake? You still think this is just about that stop?" And for the first time, Holland didn't answer. Across town, Malik sat in his living room with his sister Camille, who had flown in that morning without telling him. Her arms were crossed, tears drying on her cheeks, but her face was fierce. "You could have been killed," she said, "and I wouldn't have even known where you were. They didn't even call me." Malik looked down at his hands, still bearing faint marks from the cuffs. "That's the point, Cam. They weren't supposed to. I wasn't supposed to be seen." She stood, pacing, her voice rising. "But you were. Finally. And you didn't just win. You turned the whole thing inside out." "I didn't want a show," he said. "I wanted it to stop happening." She knelt in front of him. "You did more than that. You made them face it. On record. In court. Do you know how rare that is? He gave her a long look. Do you know how much I had to hold back to get there? And that was the part no one else had seen. The restraint. The 1,000 little moments where he could have lashed out, shouted, broken down, but didn't. The silence he held inside while being dragged, while being judged, while listening to lies about who he was. That discipline wasn't just military. It was survival. Generational. Etched into his blood from decades of men like him learning how to live in a country that only ever saw their threat, never their truth. The phone buzzed again, a message from Gloria. He opened it. One line. Judge McAllister requested to speak with you privately. Said he owes you more than a ruling. Malik didn't reply right away. Instead, he walked outside, the evening air brushing against his skin. The same streets. The same sky. But it didn't feel the same anymore. The next day, the meeting took place in the judge's private chambers. No audience. No microphones. Just the man who had once been saved by Malik's bulletproof timing and the man who had almost been destroyed by his silence. McAllister stood when Malik entered, his hands trembling slightly. Mr. Hayes, he began, but Malik held up a hand. Let's not waste time with apologies. McAllister sat, eyes wet, voice low. You saved my life. Years ago, in a mission no one wanted to talk about. I never even knew your name until yesterday. I wasn't doing it for the recognition, Malik said. I know. That's what makes this harder. I sat on that bench thinking I knew justice. Thinking I could tell right from wrong by the way someone stood or spoke or dressed. I didn't see you. Not really. You saw what you were trained to see. And that has to change, McAllister said, voice cracking. Because if I can misjudge you, after everything you've done, then what chance does a kid with no record, no medals, no military history have? Malik said nothing, and that silence was more powerful than any words. McAllister continued. There's a committee forming. Oversight on racially biased policing, judicial accountability. I want you on it. Malik raised an eyebrow. You want the guy you almost ruled against to sit beside you on policy decisions? I want the man who reminded me why I took the bench in the first place, the judge said. Malik leaned back, thoughtful. It wasn't redemption he felt. It wasn't revenge. It was something in between. The beginning of a shift. A recalibration. For years, he had disappeared into the background, used silence as armor. But maybe now, it was time to speak. Not with fury. With clarity. That evening, as he stepped back into his home, the lights low and the house quiet, he thought about what came next. Not just for him, but for everyone who'd ever been stopped, silenced, or stripped of dignity. And deep in his chest, he felt it again. That same precision he used to hold behind a scope. Only this time, it wasn't aimed at enemies in the distance. It was aimed at change. Up close. And unstoppable. The weight of everything didn't hit Malik immediately. The courtroom victory, the exposure, the shift in perception, it all moved like aftershocks, one rolling quietly after the other. He could feel it most in the spaces between the noise. When the reporters left. When Gloria drove away. When Camille returned to her own life and the phone stopped buzzing every 10 minutes. It was in the silence that the real consequences started taking shape. It wasn't about vindication anymore. It wasn't about the courtroom. It was about what followed after a truth so deeply buried is suddenly unearthed in public. What people do with that truth. How they run from it. Or worse, how they reshape it into something easier to digest. Malik wasn't looking for praise, but he wasn't blind either. He could see how the same people who once avoided eye contact with him now nodded with a strange respect. The barista who used to flinch slightly when he approached the counter now smiled too wide. A neighbor who never returned his waves suddenly wanted to talk about the system and change. But it didn't feel like progress. It felt like people trying to protect themselves from their own discomfort. A kind of performance born out of guilt, not growth. And Malik had seen too much to mistake it for something more meaningful than it was. Meanwhile, Rick Holland and Jake Mercer were suspended pending investigation, their badges and firearms turned in under the weight of public pressure and internal shame. The footage had made the rounds, first local news, then national. Edited clips, carefully narrated by reporters who used words like alleged misconduct and troubling incident, always pulling just short of calling it what it really was. Malik didn't care about the headlines, but he paid attention to the patterns. The slow rewrites. The way the story became less about systemic abuse and more about one man's inspiring journey. As if his story had magically unfolded in a vacuum, separate from the millions of others that ended in silence or death. He kept getting calls from advocacy groups, politicians, journalists. Everyone wanted a quote, a speech, a viral moment. Gloria called twice to say the DOJ might want to talk to him. There was talk of testifying before a Senate subcommittee. Malik declined, every time. Not because he didn't care, but because he wasn't ready to let his story be used as a token. Not yet. He needed the smoke to clear. He needed the truth to stay heavy, not polished. One night, a letter arrived. No return address. Just his name, handwritten in bold strokes. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was rough, the ink smudged in places. It read, "You humiliated us. You think you won, but you've made enemies. Watch your back. This isn't over." Malik read it once, then again. There was no signature, but he didn't need one. He knew where it came from. Not directly, maybe, but spiritually. It was the language of men who believed the badge made them untouchable, who were raised to think power belonged only to them. It wasn't fear that stirred in Malik's chest, it was exhaustion. Because even after everything, the threat remained. The culture that birthed that arrogance was still breathing. Camille begged him to leave town, even if just for a while. Take time, she said, somewhere quiet. Somewhere that doesn't know your name. But Malik refused. This was his home. His street. His city. He wasn't going to disappear just because the world was uncomfortable watching him walk freely through it. Judge McAllister reached out again, asking Malik to join a newly formed city council oversight committee. This time, Malik said yes. Not because he trusted the system, but because someone needed to be in the room who understood what it felt like to be crushed by it. The first meeting was awkward. For white men and one woman of color, all older, all speaking in language that tried to sound progressive but was coded in caution. Malik sat through it quietly at first, listening. Measuring. Until one of the members suggested body cam footage be reviewed, internally only, to avoid public hysteria. Malik looked up, his voice calm but direct. If the public seeing the truth is what causes hysteria, maybe it's not the footage that's the problem. The room fell silent. No one argued. In the weeks that followed, Malik found himself becoming something he never planned for, a symbol. Kids in his community stopped him on the street. Veterans he'd never met shook his hand. An older woman at the grocery store hugged him without asking and whispered, "Thank you for not letting them break you." But none of it filled him the way they expected it to. Because he wasn't healed. He was functioning. There's a difference. One afternoon, he visited the local high school to speak with students about resilience. It wasn't his idea. A teacher who had followed his story reached out. Malik agreed, reluctantly. He stood in a gymnasium, looking out at a room full of black and brown teenagers who looked at him like he had answers. He didn't pretend he did. He didn't sugarcoat it. They will judge you before they know your name, he said. They will expect you to fail. They will say you were angry, even when you were just breathing. But your dignity is not something they can take. Only something you can give away. Don't give it. A boy in the back raised his hand. What do you do when you're tired of being the bigger person? Malik didn't smile. He nodded slowly. You rest. But you don't become them. You don't let their hatred make a home in you. The gym was silent. Later, as he walked out of the building, Malik found himself thinking of his father. A man who had worked 2 jobs his whole life and died with dignity but not peace. He thought of the long hours of discipline drilled into him during sniper school. The way they trained him to wait. To watch. To act only when the moment was right. That same discipline was what kept him alive here. Not in battlefields abroad, but on American soil. That realization, more than anything else, was what he carried in his bones now. Back at the precinct, Holland had been officially terminated, his pension under review, and criminal charges under recommendation. Mercer had cut a deal, early retirement, in exchange for cooperation in the internal investigation. Malik didn't attend the hearings. He didn't need to see them fall. He needed to see the system change. Watching 2 men get punished wouldn't satisfy him. He wanted fewer names on the news. Fewer bodies on asphalt. Fewer mothers mourning sons for doing nothing more than breathing at the wrong time. But still, there were moments, small ones, where the weight caught him. Like when he was stopped one night walking into his own building by a new security guard who didn't recognize him. The man asked to see ID. Malik handed it over calmly. The guard squinted, then said, "Wait, are you that Marine from the case?" Malik just nodded, not answering. The guard stood awkwardly. "Didn't think you'd be so chill." Malik looked at him for a long time and said, "That's the problem. You never do." He didn't speak with the press. But he kept writing. Quietly, late at night. Pages of memories. Thoughts. Questions. Not for a book. Not for publication. Just for himself. For the boy he used to be. For the man he still didn't fully recognize in the mirror some mornings. The one who now walked through the world with a name that carried weight, but also danger. He still received threats. Anonymous messages. Online vitriol. But he had faced worse under moonlight in foreign deserts. He knew how to handle shadows. The real question was what kind of light he was willing to walk toward next. Because Malik was no longer running. And the people who had once tried to break him would soon learn, there's nothing more dangerous than a man who knows who he is, and still chooses peace. 1 week later, Malik sat alone in the back of a small cafe tucked between a row of brick storefronts in Richmond's East End, a quiet place with chipped tables and dusty sunlight filtering through the windows. He stirred his coffee slowly, not because he needed the drink but because the ritual kept his hands moving. He had stopped checking the news. The noise had become too loud, too shallow. Everyone had an opinion now. Pundits dissected his tone, debated the validity of his restraint, speculated whether he was a hero or a symbol or just a man caught in the right moment. But they didn't know what it had cost him. They didn't know how close he'd come to losing himself beneath the silence he was forced to carry for so long. Across from him sat Gloria, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, a legal pad resting on the table but untouched. She had grown quieter too, not in defeat but in reflection. The trial had shaken her more than she let on. It wasn't just a case, she said quietly, her voice low but intense, it was a reckoning. For all of us. Malik didn't respond right away. He kept his gaze on the window, watching a little boy across the street struggle to untangle the leash of a tiny dog. He finally spoke. "I thought it would feel better," he said, his voice almost too soft to hear. "That when it was over, I'd finally be able to breathe differently. But nothing's different. Not really." Gloria leaned forward, searching his face. "Maybe not on the surface. But something shifted. You know it did. You saw it in that courtroom. Malik shook his head slowly. They clapped for me after. You remember that? Reporters. Strangers. People who never looked twice at me before. They stood and applauded. But where were they when I was on the hood of my own car? When I was in that cell? His tone sharpened, pain threading through the edges of his words. You know what I realized in that moment? They didn't clap because they believed in me. They clapped because they were relieved. Because they got to witness a story with a clean ending. The strong black man who overcame injustice. It made them feel good. Safe. Like things were working. Gloria didn't interrupt. She let the truth settle between them. He was right. There was something seductive about a narrative that wrapped up neatly. That gave people closure without asking them to change. She finally said, maybe they needed a win so badly, they didn't care if it came at your expense. Malik looked at her, his eyes heavy. And what if I didn't win? What if there hadn't been that footage? What if I didn't have that pen in my car? What if I was someone who couldn't afford a good lawyer? Would anyone be clapping then? She didn't answer. Because the silence said more than words ever could. Just then, his phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. He ignored it. Another buzz. A message this time. He opened it, brow furrowing as he read. The message was short. Need to talk. It's important. Mercer. Gloria saw his expression shift. What is it? He handed her the phone. She read it, eyes narrowing. You're not seriously thinking about meeting him, are you? Malik didn't answer right away. Then he said, if he's reaching out now, it means something cracked. I want to know what. Later that evening, they met in a public park, near the footbridge over the James River. The sky was overcast, the wind brisk. Mercer arrived first, pacing nervously, looking around like he expected to be ambushed. When Malik approached, Mercer straightened, stuffing his hands into his coat pockets. His face was pale, thinner than before. No badge. No gun. Just a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. You alone? Mercer asked, voice dry. Malik nodded, arms crossed. I didn't come here for games, he said. You wanted to talk. So talk. Mercer looked down at the ground, then back up. They're building a case against Rick. More than just your stop. Other complaints. Stuff that got buried. I was part of it. I knew. I didn't say anything. Malik didn't flinch. So now you want what? Forgiveness? Mercer shook his head. No. I need you to understand. It wasn't always like this. When I joined the force, I believed in it. I thought I was doing the right thing. Rick, he took that and twisted it. He taught me how to look at people a certain way. How to justify things. Malik stepped closer, his voice controlled. You didn't need Rick to teach you that. You already knew what you were willing to ignore. You knew what you saw when you looked at me. Mercer's eyes shimmered. I did. And I hated myself for it. But I didn't stop. I let it happen again and again. Because the system rewarded it. Because I got promotions. Because no one questioned it. Malik stared at him for a long moment, then said, so what now? Mercer exhaled shakily. I'm going on record. Full statement. Names. Dates. Internal cover-ups. Not for you. For me. Because I have to live with what I became. Malik nodded once. Then do it. Don't expect applause. Just do the right thing. Finally. Mercer gave a weak smile. That's fair. After he left, Malik remained by the bridge, watching the river move beneath him. It reminded him of the old saying from boot camp, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Justice wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. It was deliberate. And sometimes, it came like water. Quiet. Relentless. Carving truth through stone, 1 inch at a time. Back home, he opened his journal and wrote a single line. Maybe this isn't a story about justice. Maybe it's a story about survival. He closed the book, sat back, and thought about the boy who once believed he had to earn his place in the world. Who thought if he just stood straighter, spoke softer, worked harder, maybe they'd see him differently. Maybe they'd respect him. But now he knew better. It wasn't about being seen differently. It was about seeing himself clearly. And that was something no courtroom could ever give him. That was a fight he had to win within. The next morning, Malik received an email from Judge McAllister. The committee had approved their first set of reforms: mandatory body cam audits, independent review boards, community-led oversight. Small steps. But real ones. The judge asked if Malik would attend the press conference. He replied simply, no camera. No speech. Just the work. Later that week, Malik walked into a middle school auditorium where a community workshop was being held. He wasn't the guest speaker. He wasn't even announced. He just sat in the back, listening. Watching young kids ask questions about fairness, about safety, about why some people get treated differently than others. One girl asked, "What do you do when adults don't believe you?" A silence followed. Then another voice answered from the crowd. "You keep telling the truth anyway." Malik didn't see who said it. He didn't need to. The seed was planted. And that, he realized, was the work now. Not the headlines. Not the speeches. But the quiet acts of presence. Of showing up. Of staying. Of proving, day after day, that dignity wasn't a reward for surviving the system, it was the beginning of tearing it down. Brick by brick. Name by name. Story by story. Malik stood, nodded to the organizers, and left the auditorium without a word. He didn't need to be seen anymore. He had already made himself undeniable. And now, he was building something bigger than himself. A legacy born not from war, or from trials, or from pain. But from refusal. The refusal to disappear. The refusal to stay silent. The refusal to let the next generation inherit a world he didn't fight to change. He wasn't done yet. And the world would never again get to decide who Malik Hayes was. He had already done that for himself. Late into the night, Malik found himself standing in front of his old high school, a place that hadn't changed much from when he was a teenager, roaming its halls with his head low and his heart heavy. The bleachers were still rusted in spots, the basketball court faded, the mural on the east wall barely holding its color. Yet it wasn't nostalgia that brought him here. It was something deeper, a pull to the origin of so much silence, of so many moments where he had learned how to blend in to survive, how to mask the weight he carried with a forced grin or distant stare. Back then, he didn't know how to fight for himself. Not out loud. Not in a way the world could hear. And now, years later, after everything that had unfolded, he stood beneath the same flickering street lamp where he used to wait for his sister after practice, wondering what kind of man he'd have to become just to make it home alive. The wind cut sharp against his skin, and he could smell the distant smoke of someone burning leaves down the block. It grounded him. Reminded him of the quiet rage he used to hold in his chest every time someone crossed the street when they saw him walking alone, or when a teacher clutched her purse tighter just because he asked for help on a math problem. He thought he'd buried those memories. But truth has a way of resurfacing when the world tries to define your name for you. Tonight, they weren't ghosts. They were fuel. He was meeting someone here. Not a politician, not a reporter, not a lawyer. A boy. 17. Slim frame. Wide eyes. Name was Dion. His mother had reached out after the trial. Said her son had started skipping school, getting stopped by cops for no reason, hanging with older kids who didn't care what happened to them. She said Malik was the only person he might listen to. Not because of the headlines, but because Dion had watched the entire trial on his cracked phone screen and, for the first time, saw a version of his own future that didn't end in a jail cell or a morgue. Dion showed up 20 minutes late, hoodie pulled low, shoulders hunched, a slow, reluctant gait. Malik didn't scold him. Didn't make a speech. He just nodded, motioning to the bleachers, and they sat side by side without words at first. It wasn't until the silence grew too heavy that Malik broke it. You ever get the feeling that the world's already decided who you're supposed to be? Dion shrugged. Yeah. Every damn day. Malik let that sit. Then he said, when I was your age, I thought I had two choices. Be invisible or be a threat. Because that's how they made me feel. Like anything in between didn't exist. Dion looked at him, his voice low. So which one did you pick? Malik smiled faintly, not with joy, but with understanding. I picked silence. I thought if I kept my head down, followed the rules, I could make it through. But silence doesn't save you. It just delays the fight. Dion shifted, his tone harder now. Man, I try to stay out of trouble. But it don't matter. They pull me over just for walking home with my headphones in. Like I'm supposed to apologize for breathing. Malik leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on the boy. You don't have to apologize. Not for existing. Not for being angry. But don't let that anger choose for you. Don't let it turn into something they can use against you. You hear me? Dion nodded, but it was cautious. What if it's already too late? Malik's voice softened. Then it's not. Because you're here. Talking. That means you haven't given up. That means you still get to decide who you're gonna be. They sat there for a while longer, not needing to fill the space. When Dion finally stood to leave, he turned to Malik and said, My mom said I should thank you. But I didn't really get it. Now I think I do. You didn't beat them for yourself. You did it for the rest of us. Malik didn't answer. He just placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. The next morning, Malik walked into the community center downtown for the first official oversight committee session. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't bring notes. Just presence. People greeted him with cautious respect, unsure whether he was the same quiet man they'd read about. In the room, seated around the circular table, were lawyers, activists, city officials, and officers from the newly reassigned Internal Affairs Unit. Some offered forced smiles. Others avoided his gaze. He didn't mind. He wasn't there to be liked. The meeting started tense. A proposal about transparency policies was met with lukewarm enthusiasm. An officer objected to releasing use of force reports, citing officer safety. Malik raised his voice for the first time. What about the safety of the people being stopped? Do their families get a say when their names end up on body tags instead of paperwork? The room quieted. He continued. We're not here to protect systems. We're here to protect lives. If that makes people uncomfortable, good. Discomfort means something's shifting. One of the older committee members, a retired judge, leaned forward. Mr. Hayes, with all due respect, there's a process to these changes. Things take time. Malik's gaze didn't waver. Time is something too many of us don't get. I'm not here to wait for comfort. I'm here for accountability. The tension didn't ease, but it clarified. From that moment on, no one doubted his role in the room. That night, as he walked home, his phone buzzed again. This time it was Camille. Her voice was tight, anxious. You're gonna see something on the news tonight. They're talking about retaliation. Some online group leaking addresses, threatening whistleblowers. Malik stopped cold on the sidewalk, heart heavy. "You good?" She hesitated. "I'm fine. But be careful. Promise me." Malik looked around at the quiet neighborhood, the way every shadow suddenly felt like a potential threat. "I will," he said, though they both knew safety was never a promise. Back at home, he pulled out the small safe beneath his bed and opened it. Inside were old documents, medals, photographs. He reached for a single envelope and pulled out a photo, one taken years ago on deployment. 6 Marines. Covered in dust and sweat, but smiling. Malik in the center. Alive. Whole. He stared at it for a long time, remembering names that never made it back. Voices lost to sand and gunfire. He wasn't supposed to be the one still standing. And yet, he was. Later, he sat at his kitchen table, lights dimmed, writing again. Not for the public. For Dion. For his future. A letter he'd never send, but needed to write. You'll want to give up. Some days, it'll feel like the world is daring you to. But don't. Your breath is resistance. Your survival is rebellion. They can't take your truth unless you hand it over. Don't hand it over. Ever. The noise would continue. The threats. The slow, grinding work of reform that always came too late. But Malik had stopped waiting for the system to deliver justice like a favor. He was building something slower, but stronger. A foundation of presence. Of truth. Of refusal. He didn't need the world to see him as a hero. He just needed the next young man pulled over for nothing to have someone waiting for him on the other side. To say, I know. I see you. You're not alone. And that, more than anything, was the revolution. Not the verdict. Not the coverage. But the decision to stay present. To stay visible. To stay human in a world that tried, again and again, to erase him. He wasn't going anywhere. It took nearly a year for the full investigation to close, but when it did, the consequences were absolute. Rick Holland was convicted of multiple counts of evidence tampering, unlawful arrest, and misconduct in public office. The courtroom that once echoed with his arrogance now bore witness to his unraveling. He tried to stand tall during sentencing, eyes scanning the room for someone to validate his version of the story, that he was a good cop caught in a political storm, but no one stood with him. Not even Jake Mercer, who by then had relocated to another state, quietly working in community mediation, far from the force and the man he once idolized. Mercer had testified fully, providing crucial details of patterns and cover-ups that reached far beyond Malik's case. His cooperation earned him protection, but not peace. In a rare moment of humility, he sent Malik a letter, handwritten, apologizing not just for what he had done, but for who he had allowed himself to become. Malik never responded. Some things didn't need answers. The Reform Board meetings grew into something real. No longer performative, they became spaces of challenge, pushback, and breakthrough. Community voices grew louder, more organized, and Malik, though never seeking attention, became a pillar within those walls. His voice didn't carry like a politician's, it carried like someone who had walked through fire barefoot and returned with the ashes of proof. He didn't argue for visibility. He argued for structural change. He fought for every person who would never see a courtroom, who'd never get a second chance, who'd be swallowed by the silence. And slowly, policies began to shift. Body cam audits became public record. Citizen complaint data was made transparent. More officers were removed from duty, not because of public outcry, but because there was finally a mechanism that listened. Dion, the teenager Malik met on the bleachers, didn't disappear. He stayed in touch. He started mentoring younger kids at his school, got involved with a local youth justice program, and even applied for a city scholarship named after community changemakers. When Malik read the essay Dion submitted with his application, he had to sit down. In it, Dion wrote, I used to think survival was enough. But I met someone who taught me that presence is power. That sometimes, just showing up as who you are is the most radical thing you can do. Malik folded the letter and kept it in his wallet, not for the words, but for the reminder that the most lasting change often grows in silence, unseen. Camille eventually convinced Malik to take a break. Not to run, not to hide, but to breathe. They went on a short trip together, driving down the coast, staying in small towns where no one recognized his name. It was the first time in years that Malik allowed himself to feel something close to lightness. He swam in the ocean. He read fiction again. He even laughed, deep, real laughs, the kind that start in your chest and shake out of you like a release. Camille watched him with quiet joy, knowing that her brother, after everything, was still intact. But it was a letter from Judge McAllister that truly closed the loop. Typed, formal, mailed to Malik's home with no fanfare. In it, the judge wrote, "You reminded me why justice was never supposed to be quiet. I can never undo my silence, but I can be louder now, and I intend to be. Thank you for saving my life, twice." Malik folded that letter too and placed it next to Dion's. Not as trophies, but as truths. Proof that the fight had reached places he'd never intended, and still mattered. Malik didn't return to his job in security. Instead, he began working with returning veterans, helping them transition from silence to purpose. Many of them carried their own ghosts, buried under medals and trauma, unsure how to be heard in a world that only valued their sacrifice, not their survival. Malik didn't offer therapy. He offered space. A place to talk, to write, to breathe. And he told them, again and again, the war may be over, but your story isn't. Don't let them tell it for you. He watched them slowly reclaim themselves, one sentence at a time. His home remained the same, modest and tucked on the same street where it all began. But it was no longer a place of retreat. It became a hub, a quiet meeting ground for organizers, students, families, and even former officers willing to confront the cost of their silence. Malik never raised his voice in those rooms. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to anchor the truth. And as the seasons passed, as his face began to age with dignity, as his body still carried the weight of all he had endured, Malik Hayes became something that few men ever do, undeniable. Not just for what he had survived, but for how he had refused to become the thing that tried to destroy him. He turned pain into policy, silence into power, and injustice into legacy. His story didn't end in the courtroom. It didn't end in the headlines. It continued in every person who chose to remain standing when the world told them to disappear. Now, take a moment. Breathe. Let this story settle into your skin. Because it wasn't just about a Marine, or a trial, or a broken system. It was about something much deeper. About dignity. About what it means to choose presence in a world that profits off your absence. Malik's journey was more than survival, it was a declaration. That no uniform, no title, no accusation can strip you of your worth. That when the truth finally breaks through, it doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand. So now I ask you, what does justice look like to you? And more importantly, what will you do when it's your turn to speak, to act, to stand? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. Your voice matters more than you know. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, inspired, or awakened something inside, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. There are more stories coming. Real ones. Stories that refuse to stay silent. Thank you for being here.